The clock had just struck midnight at Buckingham Palace when King Charles III made a decision that would send shockwaves through the British monarchy and capture the attention of millions worldwide. What started as a quiet evening discussion between father and son transformed into a pivotal moment that would reshape the future of the crown forever. Behind the ornate walls of the palace, where centuries of royal tradition have been carefully preserved, a conversation was taking place that would challenge everything the public thought they knew about the royal family's future plans. The decision King Charles made in those crucial overnight hours would not only affect Prince William's path to the throne, but would also reveal the deeply personal struggles and calculated moves happening within the world's most watched family. This is the untold story of how one night changed the course of royal history, involving secret meetings, family tensions, constitutional questions, and a father's unprecedented choice that left even the most seasoned royal experts speechless. What you're about to discover goes far beyond the carefully crafted public statements and reveals the real drama unfolding behind palace doors. The evening of February 12, 2026, began like any other at Buckingham Palace. King Charles III sat in his private study, surrounded by the familiar comfort of leather-bound books and family photographs that had witnessed decades of royal history. The soft glow from his desk lamp illuminated the stack of official documents that required his attention, but his mind was elsewhere, wrestling with thoughts that had been consuming him for weeks. At 18 years old, Charles had spent most of his life preparing for the throne, and now, after more than a year as king, he found himself facing questions he never anticipated. The weight of the crown felt heavier than ever, not because of its physical presence, but because of the profound decisions it demanded. The conversation he was about to have with his eldest son would change everything. Prince William arrived at the palace just after 9 o'clock that evening, having travelled from his family home at Windsor Castle. The usual formalities were set aside as father and son settled into the familiar rhythm of their private discussions. William had noticed the increasing frequency of these evening meetings over the past month, each one seeming more serious than the last. The king began by discussing the recent polling numbers that showed public opinion about the monarchy reaching concerning levels. Young people, in particular, seemed increasingly disconnected from the royal family, viewing them as outdated relics in a rapidly changing world. Social media was filled with debates about the relevance of hereditary monarchy in the 21st century, and Republican movements across the Commonwealth were gaining momentum. William listened carefully as his father outlined the challenges facing the institution they both served. The cost of maintaining the monarchy during a cost-of-living crisis had become a source of public frustration. Environmental concerns were being raised about the royal estates and travel arrangements. Most troubling of all, surveys suggested that support for the monarchy might not survive the transition to William's generation without significant changes. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Charles pulled out a leather portfolio containing documents that William had never seen before. These were not the usual briefing papers or constitutional matters that typically dominated their discussions. Instead, they contained detailed analyses prepared by constitutional experts, polling data from across the Commonwealth realms, and most surprisingly, preliminary discussions with government officials about unprecedented changes to the monarchy's structure. Charles explained that he had been quietly consulting with Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, senior civil servants, and constitutional scholars about possibilities that had never been seriously considered in modern times. The king revealed that he had been exploring whether it might be possible to implement significant reforms that would make the monarchy more responsive to public opinion while maintaining its essential constitutional role. The most shocking revelation came when Charles disclosed that he had been considering the possibility of implementing term limits for future monarchs. The idea was radical and had never been seriously discussed in British constitutional history. Rather than serving for life, future kings and queens might serve for fixed periods, perhaps 25 years, before stepping aside to allow the next generation to take over with fresh perspectives and energy. William was stunned by the proposal. The concept challenged everything he had been taught about kingship and the sacred nature of the coronation oath. Yet, as his father continued to explain the reasoning behind this revolutionary idea, William began to see the logic. A younger monarch might be better positioned to connect with modern Britain and the Commonwealth. Regular transitions could prevent the monarchy from becoming stagnant and allow for periodic renewal. The king went further, suggesting that this change could begin with his own reign. Rather than waiting for natural succession, Charles proposed that he might consider stepping aside in favor of William within the next few years, but with the understanding that William would also commit to stepping aside for Prince George when the time was right. This would create a new model of royal succession based on planned transitions rather than the traditional lifelong service. As the evening wore on, Charles shared more of his vision for a reformed monarchy. He envisioned a more streamlined royal family, with clearer roles and responsibilities for working royals. The idea was to make the institution more cost-effective and purposeful, addressing many of the criticisms that had been mounting in recent years. The king had even been exploring the possibility of making royal appointments more merit-based, with family members earning their positions through demonstrated service rather than automatic entitlement. William found himself torn between tradition and innovation. On one hand, the proposals his father was outlining could potentially save the monarchy by making it more relevant and acceptable to modern society. On the other hand, they represented such a dramatic departure from centuries of precedent that they might fundamentally alter the nature of kingship itself. The discussion continued past midnight, with both men acutely aware that they were potentially laying the groundwork for the most significant constitutional changes in British history. Charles emphasised that nothing could be decided quickly or without extensive consultation with Parliament, the Church of England, and the governments of the Commonwealth realms. However, he wanted William to understand the direction of his thinking and to begin considering what role he might play in this transformation. As the night progressed, Charles revealed that he had already begun informal discussions with Archbishop of Canterbury about the theological implications of planned royal transitions. The concept of divine appointment and lifelong service had deep religious significance, and any changes would need to be carefully considered from a spiritual perspective. The Archbishop had been surprisingly open to exploring how Christian concepts of stewardship might actually support the idea of planned transitions rather than oppose them. The king also disclosed that he had been in communication with monarchs from other European countries about their experiences with more modern approaches to royal succession. Several constitutional monarchies had already implemented reforms that made their royal families more accountable and responsive to public opinion. Sweden, Norway, and the Netherlands had all modernized their monarchies in ways that had actually increased public support rather than diminished it. William learned that his father had been particularly influenced by conversations with King Willem-Alexander of the Netherlands, who had emphasized the importance of making the monarchy feel relevant and valuable to ordinary citizens. The Dutch approach focused on visible public service, environmental leadership, and economic development, creating a model of monarchy that felt productive rather than merely ceremonial. The evening concluded with Charles presenting William with a confidential document outlining a potential timeline for implementing these changes. The proposal suggested that formal discussions with government officials and constitutional experts could begin within the next 6 months, with the possibility of announcing preliminary plans by the end of 2026. If everything proceeded smoothly, the first planned royal transition could occur as early as 2028, coinciding with significant anniversaries that would provide natural opportunities for ceremonial change. As William prepared to leave the palace in the early hours of February 13th, he carried with him not just the weight of these revelations, but also a new understanding of his father's profound commitment to ensuring the monarchy's survival. The king was willing to sacrifice personal tradition and even his own extended reign to create something that might better serve future generations. The drive back to Windsor Castle gave William time to process everything he had learned. The proposals were bold, potentially brilliant, and undeniably risky. They represented a gamble that constitutional monarchy could be reinvented for the modern age, but they also carried the possibility of unintended consequences that could destabilize the very institution they were trying to preserve. By the time William arrived home, he knew that his life and the lives of his children had been fundamentally altered by the conversation. The comfortable predictability of traditional royal succession had been replaced by something far more complex and challenging. The question now was not just when he would become king, but how he would help reshape what kingship itself would mean for the 21st century and beyond. The following morning brought no respite from the intensity of the previous night's revelations. William woke before dawn, his mind racing with the implications of his father's unprecedented proposals. Catherine noticed his restlessness immediately, and over their private breakfast, he found himself in the difficult position of sharing earth-shattering news that could not yet be discussed with anyone outside their immediate family. Catherine's reaction was a mixture of shock and thoughtful consideration. As someone who had married into the royal family from the outside, she had always maintained a unique perspective on the institution's strengths and weaknesses. Her initial response focused on their children and how such dramatic changes might affect Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis. The prospect of planned succession would fundamentally alter their children's futures in ways that were both liberating and concerning. Meanwhile, at Buckingham Palace, King Charles was already in motion with the next phase of his carefully orchestrated plan. His first call of the day was to Sir Clive Alderton, his principal private secretary, who had been kept informed of the general direction of the king's thinking, but was now being briefed on the specific proposals that had been shared with William. The conversation was necessarily delicate, as it involved constitutional matters that could not be handled through normal governmental channels. Sir Clive's expertise in constitutional law and his years of experience serving the royal family made him uniquely qualified to advise on the practical implications of the king's proposals. His initial assessment was cautious, but not dismissive. He emphasized that any changes of this magnitude would require unprecedented coordination between Buckingham Palace, Downing Street, Parliament, the Church of England, and the governments of all Commonwealth realms where the British monarch served as head of state. The complexity of the constitutional implications became clearer as Sir Clive outlined the various legal and procedural hurdles that would need to be addressed. The Succession to the Crown Act would need to be amended, which would require legislation in the UK Parliament and potentially in the parliaments of other Commonwealth realms. The coronation oath would need to be reconsidered as it traditionally involves promises to serve for life. Most significantly, the entire concept of parliamentary sovereignty, which is partly based on the continuity of the crown, would need to be re-examined. By midday, Charles had expanded the circle of confidential consultations to include Lord Christopher Geet, a former private secretary who had extensive experience with constitutional matters and maintained excellent relationships across the political spectrum. Lord Geet's initial response was similar to Sir Clive's, acknowledging the potential benefits of the King's proposals while emphasizing the enormous challenges involved in implementation. The afternoon brought a secure video conference with selected governors-general from major Commonwealth realms. These representatives of the Crown in countries like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand would play crucial roles in any constitutional changes, as their governments would need to approve modifications to the role of the British monarch as their head of state. The conversations were necessarily preliminary and hypothetical, but they provided valuable insights into how different Commonwealth countries might respond to proposed changes. The Canadian Governor-General expressed particular interest in the proposals, noting that recent polling had shown declining support for the monarchy among younger Canadians. The possibility of more frequent transitions in younger monarchs might actually strengthen support for maintaining the constitutional connection to the British Crown. Similarly, the Australian representative acknowledged that Republican sentiment had been growing, but that a more modern and responsive monarchy might address some of the concerns driving that movement. Back at Windsor Castle, William spent the day in deep discussion with Catherine about the personal implications of his father's proposals. They walked through the castle grounds using the privacy of the outdoors to discuss matters that could not be overheard by staff or recorded by security systems. The conversation was emotionally charged, as both recognized that their entire life plan was potentially being rewritten. Catherine raised important questions about their children's education and preparation for royal roles. If planned succession became the norm, Prince George might become king much younger than traditionally expected, but he would also face the certainty of eventually stepping aside rather than ruling for life. This would require a completely different approach to royal education and preparation, focusing more on leadership skills and adaptability rather than the traditional emphasis on duty and permanence. The couple also discussed the potential personal benefits of the proposed changes. A fixed term of royal service might allow them to have more normal family relationships and personal fulfillment after their royal duties ended. Unlike traditional monarchs who served until death, they might have opportunities for different types of service or even private pursuits in their later years. However, they also recognized the challenges of maintaining dignity and purpose as former monarchs in a society that had never experienced such transitions. As evening approached, William received an encrypted message from his father, requesting another private meeting, this time with a difference. Charles wanted to include Princess Anne in their discussions, recognizing that any major constitutional changes would require support from other senior members of the royal family. Princess Anne's reputation for straight talk and practical wisdom made her an essential ally in evaluating the feasibility of the proposed changes. The meeting convened at 8 o'clock in the King's private study, with Princess Anne arriving directly from her own official engagements. Her reaction to her brother's proposals was characteristically direct and probing. She immediately questioned the practical implications for the working royal family and the potential impact on the numerous charities and organizations that depended on royal patronage. Princess Anne's concerns centered on continuity of service and public confidence. She pointed out that many of the monarchy's most valuable contributions came from long-term relationships and deep expertise developed over decades of involvement with particular causes or organizations. Frequent transitions might disrupt these relationships and reduce the effectiveness of royal patronage. However, she also acknowledged the growing challenges facing the monarchy and the potential advantages of the king's proposed solutions. Her extensive experience with public opinion and media relations gave her insights into how different demographic groups might respond to various changes. She was particularly interested in the potential for planned succession to generate positive media coverage and public engagement around each transition. The discussion with Princess Anne revealed additional complexities that had not been fully considered in the initial conversations between Charles and William. Questions arose about the roles of other family members, the timing of transitions, and the criteria for determining when changes should occur. Princess Anne suggested that any new system would need clear, objective standards rather than subjective decisions that might create controversy or family conflicts. Late in the evening, the conversation turned to international implications and precedents. Charles revealed that he had been quietly researching historical examples of planned royal transitions and voluntary abdications, looking for models that might inform a British approach. While the British monarchy's unique constitutional role made direct comparisons difficult, there were examples from other countries that provided useful insights. The king had been particularly interested in the Japanese imperial system, which had successfully managed a planned transition in 2019 when Emperor Akihito abdicated in favor of his son. The Japanese experience demonstrated that carefully managed royal transitions could actually strengthen public support and create opportunities for renewal and celebration. Similarly, Charles had studied the Dutch succession in 2013, when Queen Beatrix stepped aside for King Willem-Alexander after 33 years on the throne. The Dutch transition had been widely celebrated and had coincided with significant increases in public support for the monarchy. The careful planning and positive framing of that transition provided a potential model for how similar changes might be implemented in Britain. As the meeting concluded near midnight, the three senior royals found themselves in agreement on several key points. First, any changes would need to be implemented gradually and with extensive public consultation. Second, the new system would need to maintain the essential constitutional functions of the monarchy while making it more responsive to changing social expectations. Third, the success of any reforms would depend heavily on how they were presented to the public and whether they could be framed as positive evolution rather than desperate reaction to criticism. Princess Anne agreed to join the confidential planning process, bringing her extensive experience and practical perspective to the discussions. She also volunteered to begin informal conversations with other European royal families to gather additional insights and potential support for the proposed changes. The evening ended with an agreement to expand the circle of consultation carefully and systematically. Within the next week, they would approach Prince Edward and the Countess of Wessex, recognizing that any major changes would affect all working members of the royal family. They also planned to begin very preliminary discussions with senior church officials and constitutional experts, always maintaining strict confidentiality until they had a clearer picture of the feasibility and implications of their proposals. As William drove home to Windsor for the second night in a row carrying revolutionary royal secrets, he reflected on how quickly his world was changing. The comfortable certainties of traditional monarchy were being replaced by something far more complex and potentially powerful. The next few months would determine whether the British monarchy could successfully reinvent itself for a new era, or whether the attempt at change might create more problems than it solved. The weight of history felt heavier than ever, but so did the possibility of creating something genuinely new and better suited to serve the British people and the Commonwealth in the decades ahead. 3 weeks after that momentous overnight decision, the ripple effects of King Charles's revolutionary proposal had begun to spread through the highest levels of British government and beyond. What had started as a private family discussion was now quietly engaging some of the most powerful people in the country, each sworn to absolute secrecy as they grappled with the constitutional implications of reinventing monarchy for the modern age. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak received his first detailed briefing on the King's proposals during a private audience at Buckingham Palace on March 6. The meeting, officially recorded as a routine consultation on Commonwealth matters, actually lasted merely 3 hours, as the two men explored the political ramifications of planned royal succession. Sunak's initial reaction was one of careful consideration rather than immediate opposition, recognizing both the potential benefits and risks of such unprecedented change. The Prime Minister's concerns centered on parliamentary procedure and public opinion. Any constitutional changes would require careful management through both houses of Parliament, with extensive committee hearings and public debate. The political timing would be crucial, as the government would need broad cross-party support for changes that could be seen as either modernizing progress or dangerous constitutional experimentation. Sunak was particularly interested in the polling data that Charles had been collecting, which showed surprising openness to royal reform among younger voters. Focus groups suggested that planned succession might actually increase support for the monarchy by making it feel more accountable and responsive. However, the same research indicated strong resistance among older voters, who viewed royal service as a sacred lifetime commitment. Meanwhile, William had been conducting his own quiet consultations with trusted advisors and friends outside the royal household. These conversations were necessarily oblique and hypothetical, but they provided valuable insights into how different segments of society might respond to major royal changes. His discussions with military leaders, charity executives, and Commonwealth officials revealed a complex landscape of opinion that defied simple categorization. The military response was particularly interesting, as many senior officers expressed private concerns about the impact of frequent leadership changes on their traditional loyalty to the crown. However, younger officers suggested that planned transitions might actually strengthen military connections to the monarchy by ensuring that monarchs remained relevant and engaged with contemporary challenges. Catherine had taken on the delicate task of exploring international perspectives through her extensive network of contacts in other royal families and diplomatic circles. Her conversations with European royalty revealed that several other monarchies were watching British developments with great interest, as they faced similar challenges in maintaining public support and relevance. The Belgian and Swedish royal families were particularly supportive of the concept of royal reform, sharing their own experiences with modernizing ancient institutions. The Norwegian monarchy's success in maintaining high approval ratings through active engagement with social issues provided another encouraging example of how traditional roles could be adapted for contemporary expectations. By late March, the confidential consultation process had expanded to include key religious leaders beyond the Church of England. The King had personally met with representatives from Scotland's Presbyterian Church, the Catholic Church in England and Wales, and leaders from other major faiths represented in British society. These discussions explored the theological and moral dimensions of planned royal service, seeking to understand how different religious perspectives might view the proposed changes. The Archbishop of Canterbury had been developing a sophisticated theological argument that planned royal succession might actually represent a more Christian approach to leadership, emphasizing stewardship and service rather than power and permanence. This perspective reframed abdication not as abandonment of duty, but as responsible transition of stewardship to the next generation. The most delicate aspect of the consultation process involved the Commonwealth realms, where the British monarch serves as head of state. Each of these countries would need to approve any constitutional changes, and their responses varied significantly based on local political circumstances and historical relationships with the Crown. Canada emerged as potentially the most supportive of the Commonwealth realms, with preliminary discussions suggesting that planned succession might actually help preserve the constitutional monarchy in the face of growing Republican sentiment. The possibility of more frequent renewal and younger monarchs appealed to Canadian officials as a way to maintain relevance while respecting tradition. Australia presented a more complex picture, with some officials viewing the proposed changes as an opportunity to create a more modern relationship with the Crown, while others saw them as unnecessary complications that might accelerate the Republican movement. The Australian perspective was particularly important because of the country's history of Republican referendums and ongoing constitutional debates. New Zealand's response was cautiously positive, with officials expressing interest in the potential for reformed monarchy to address some of the concerns that had been raised about the relevance of hereditary leadership in a modern democracy. The New Zealand government was particularly interested in how planned succession might create opportunities for greater Commonwealth cooperation and shared initiatives. As spring progressed, the planning process entered a new phase focused on practical implementation questions. Constitutional lawyers were quietly commissioned to draft preliminary legislation that could serve as a framework for implementing planned succession. These documents, marked with the highest security classifications, outlined the complex legal changes that would be required across multiple jurisdictions. The drafting process revealed numerous technical challenges that had not been immediately apparent in the initial discussions. Questions arose about the exact length of royal terms, the process for transition ceremonies, the legal status of retired monarchs, and the implications for royal finances and properties. Each issue required careful consideration of precedent, public opinion, and practical implementation. William found himself increasingly involved in detailed planning discussions as the person who would be most immediately affected by any changes. His growing engagement with the process reflected both his commitment to making reforms work and his recognition that success would largely depend on how well the next generation of royals could adapt to new expectations and responsibilities. The Prince of Wales began developing specific ideas about how his own eventual reign might operate under a system of planned succession. His vision emphasized active leadership on critical issues like environmental protection, social justice, and Commonwealth development. Rather than the traditional royal approach of careful political neutrality, William envisioned a more engaged monarchy that could provide moral leadership on issues where there was broad public consensus. Catherine's role in the planning process expanded to include specific consideration of how royal spouses would function under a system of fixed terms. Traditional queen consorts had typically developed their roles over decades of gradual involvement, but planned succession would require more rapid and intensive preparation for royal duties. This led to discussions about more structured training programs and clearer definitions of spousal responsibilities. The couple also spent considerable time discussing how to prepare their children for a fundamentally different type of royal future. Prince George, in particular, would need education that prepared him not just for kingship, but for the unique challenge of planned abdication and the transition to post-royal life. This required completely rethinking traditional royal education and the entire concept of royal preparation. By early May, the confidential consultation process had reached a critical decision point. The feedback from government officials, religious leaders, Commonwealth representatives, and constitutional experts had been largely positive, but with significant caveats about implementation challenges and political risks. The king faced a momentous choice about whether to proceed with formal proposals or to step back from such revolutionary changes. The decision-making process culminated in a series of family meetings throughout the first week of May, bringing together all the senior working royals for unprecedented discussions about the future of their institution. These conversations were emotionally charged, as family members grappled with the implications of abandoning traditions that had defined their roles and identities for generations. Princess Anne emerged as a crucial voice in favor of proceeding with the reforms, arguing that the monarchy's survival required bold action rather than cautious preservation of existing approaches. Her practical assessment was that traditional monarchy was slowly dying anyway, and that planned change was preferable to gradual decline or sudden crisis. Prince Edward and the Countess of Wessex were more cautious, expressing concerns about unintended consequences and the difficulty of maintaining public confidence during such major transitions. However, they ultimately agreed that the thorough consultation process had identified enough potential benefits to justify careful experimentation with new approaches. The final family decision was reached on May 8, exactly 3 months after the king's original overnight revelation to William. After hours of discussion, debate, and emotional consideration of the implications, the royal family agreed to proceed with the next phase of the process, formal consultation with the Parliament and the governments of the Commonwealth realms. King Charles authorised the preparation of a confidential white paper outlining the proposed changes and their rationale, to be shared initially with the Prime Minister and senior parliamentary leaders from all major political parties. The document would present the case for planned royal succession as a evolutionary development rather than a revolutionary break with tradition, emphasizing continuity of constitutional function alongside renewal of royal personnel. The decision to proceed represented both culmination and beginning. 3 months of private consultation had established the feasibility and potential benefits of unprecedented royal reform, but the real challenge would come with public disclosure and democratic consideration of changes that could reshape the British Constitution for generations to come. As William left Buckingham Palace following that final family meeting, he carried with him not just the weight of impending kingship, but the responsibility for shepherding the monarchy through its most significant transformation in centuries. The overnight decision that had begun this process had grown into something far larger than anyone had initially imagined, with implications that extended well beyond the royal family to the very heart of British democracy and constitutional government. The story that had begun with a father's concern for his son's future had evolved into a comprehensive plan for ensuring that the monarchy could continue to serve the British people effectively in an era of rapid social, political, and technological change. Whether that plan would ultimately succeed would depend on the wisdom of its implementation and the response of a public that had never before been asked to consider such fundamental changes to their ancient constitutional system. The next chapter of this unprecedented royal story would be written not in private palace meetings, but in the full glare of public scrutiny and democratic debate, as Britain prepared to consider whether its monarchy could be successfully reinvented for the 21st century and beyond.